Whisper. Power does not always vanish in thunder. Sometimes it dissolves, soft as dusk. Whisper. Stones remember the empire's breath, even as shadows lengthen and names fade. Whisper. Swords sleep and scripture stirs, transforming memory into myth. Whisper. What is lost is not forgotten but transformed, rewritten in silence. Whisper. In the hush between worlds, transformation begins, a quiet reset echoing through time. As the voice of the emperor grew faint, the world did not fall into absolute silence. Something else rose to fill the void. It was an echo, but an echo of a sound that had never been heard before in the halls of power. It was the sound of prayer, of chanted scripture, of sermons that spoke not of earthly glory, but of heavenly reward. The institutions of Rome, the Senate, the courts, the legions were all built on the bedrock of tradition and visible might. They were solid, tangible things. But as they began to crumble, this new authority emerged from the intangible realm of faith, a power that could not be seen or touched, yet was felt more profoundly than any imperial decree. This was the beginning of the Great Reset. It was not a conscious plan devised in a secret chamber, but a slow, organic process of adaptation. The world craved order. It longed for meaning in the face of growing chaos. The old Roman system had provided that order through law and military force. But when that system faltered, humanity sought a new anchor. It found it in the promise of Christianity. The religion that had once been persecuted, driven underground, now offered a framework for life, a moral compass in a world that had lost its direction. It provided answers to questions the old gods had long ceased to address. The genius of this reset was that it did not seek to destroy Rome entirely, but to repurpose it. The architecture of the empire became the scaffolding for a new spiritual edifice. The administrative districts of the Romans, the dioceses, were adopted by the church, with bishops taking on roles of authority that once belonged to provincial governors. The language of Roman law, with its precision and logic, was used to shape theological doctrine. It was a remarkable act of historical alchemy, transforming the dying body of a worldly empire into the living vessel of a spiritual one. The cross was not merely replacing the eagle, it was being stamped upon it. This transformation was profound and deeply mysterious. It was a shift from the visible to the invisible. Roman power had been displayed in triumphal arches, in colossal statues, in the marching spectacle of its armies. This new power was found in the quiet humility of a martyr's tomb, in the solemn ritual of the Eucharist, in the shared belief of a community bound by a sacred text. It was a power that grew not from conquest, but from conversion, spreading not by the sword, but by the word. The world was not just changing its rulers, it was changing its mind, its very understanding of what power was and where it came from. The adoption of Christianity was not simply a change of religion for the Roman Empire, it was a fundamental rewiring of its soul. Imagine a vast ancient machine, its gears groaning, its purpose lost. Suddenly, a new engineer arrives, not to scrap the machine, but to connect it to an entirely different power source. This was the role Constantine played. His vision of the cross in the sky before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge was more than a personal conversion. It was the moment the empire began to pivot. The sun god, Sol Invictus, whose imagery had long been associated with the emperor, was slowly and subtly merged with, and then eclipsed by, the figure of Christ. This was a strategic reset of immense consequence. By embracing Christianity, the Roman state harnessed a force it had previously tried and failed to extinguish. This new faith had a universal appeal that the old pagan teachings, tied as they were to specific places and traditions, could never match. It offered a message of hope and equality, at least in the eyes of God, that resonated with slaves, soldiers, women, and nobles alike. It created a new, unified identity that transcended the old divisions of tribe and province. You were no longer just a Goth, a Frank or a Roman, you were a Christian, a member of a single universal body. The rise of this new sun cast the old world into shadow. The gods of the pantheon, who had overseen Rome's ascent to glory, were now reframed as demons, their temples abandoned or reconsecrated. The philosophical schools of Athens, which had debated the nature of the good life for centuries, were silenced by the certainty of divine revelation. A new kind of authority was being forged, one based not on reasoned argument or ancestral tradition, but on dogma. The truth was no longer something to be discovered through inquiry, but something to be received through faith. The bishop, with his staff and his sacred texts, became a more powerful figure than the magistrate. This shift was not without its own forms of violence and coercion. It was a revolution, and revolutions are rarely gentle. But it was, at its core, a recalibration. Rome was attempting to save itself by changing its very definition of what it meant to be Roman. The empire of Augustus had been built on civic virtue and military might. The empire of Theodosius would be built on orthodox belief and the suppression of heresy. It was a desperate, audacious gamble to find a new source of cohesion in a fracturing world, to trade the fading light of a temporal sun for the promised dawn of a spiritual one. History rarely moves in straight lines. It pivots, it recalibrates. The transition from the Roman to the medieval world was perhaps the greatest recalibration the West has ever known. It was less a collapse and more a profound re-evaluation of everything that mattered. The ultimate goals of society shifted. The Roman ideal had been the pursuit of glory, the expansion of the empire, the construction of magnificent cities, and the enjoyment of a civilized life. The new Christianized ideal was the pursuit of salvation. The earthly city, as St. Augustine argued, was a temporary flawed reflection of the eternal city of God. This was a seismic shift in human ambition. This recalibration changed the very rhythm of life. The Roman calendar, with its festivals honoring gods and celebrating military victories, was gradually replaced by the liturgical calendar. Time itself was reorganized around the life of Christ and his saints. The week was now punctuated by the Sunday obligation, the year by the cycles of Lent, Easter, and Christmas. This new rhythm oriented society away from the horizontal timeline of imperial history and toward the vertical dimension of eternity. Your life was no longer just a small part of the story of Rome. It was a pilgrimage, a test, a preparation for the world to come. The economy also underwent a fundamental reset. The vast, interconnected trade network of the Roman Mediterranean, which had brought grain from Egypt and wine from Gaul, slowly broke down. In its place, a more localized agrarian economy emerged. The great estates, the latifundia, which had been worked by armies of slaves, transformed into the manors of the medieval world, worked by serfs. Wealth was no longer measured primarily in gold and commerce, but in land and loyalty. This was not a simple decline. It was the birth of a new economic system, feudalism, designed for a world of insecurity and local self-sufficiency. This was not a period of invention, but of profound adaptation. The tools, the laws, the very language of Rome were not discarded, but reforged for a new purpose. The Roman Basilica, a public hall for law and commerce, became the architectural blueprint for the Christian Church. The skills of Roman administrators were now used to manage the vast landholdings of monasteries and bishoprics. The empire's legacy was not erased. It was absorbed, digested, and reanimated within a new spiritual framework. The world was being rebuilt with the stones of the old, but according to a completely different design. It was a great, painful, and necessary recalibration. The symbols of an age tell its deepest story. In the heart of the Roman world, the ultimate symbol of knowledge and authority was the scroll. It contained the law, the histories of Livy, the poetry of Virgil, and the philosophies of Seneca. To unroll a scroll was to access the accumulated wisdom and power of the empire. It was a linear, continuous text, mirroring the unbroken line of Roman history and the vast, connected expanse of its territory. The scrolls were kept in great libraries, like the one in Alexandria, monuments to an empire that, well, believed it could catalogue and comprehend the entire world. They represented a power that was textual, legal, and historical. But as the empire frayed, another symbol began to assert its dominance: the cross. It was a symbol of startling simplicity and, honestly, brutal power. It represented not a long line of text, but a single world-altering event. It spoke not of worldly knowledge, but of divine sacrifice and the promise of redemption. Where the scroll was complex, the cross was immediate. Where the scroll required literacy and scholarship, the cross required only faith. It began to appear everywhere: on shields, on coins, atop hills, and eventually on the spires of great cathedrals that would replace the pagan temples. The world's central axis was shifting from the horizontal line of the scroll to the intersecting lines of the cross. This transformation was mirrored in the physical form of the book itself. The scroll gave way to the codex, the bound book with individual pages that we know today. This was actually a Christian technology. It was easier to conceal, easier to transport, and crucially, easier to navigate. You could quickly flip to a specific passage, compare one gospel with another, cross-reference a prophecy. The codex was a tool for a religion based on a fixed canon of sacred texts. The very structure of the book encouraged a new way of thinking, analytical, comparative, and focused on a single authoritative source of truth. The fluid, continuous narrative of the scroll was replaced by the indexed, searchable truth of the codex. So the scroll became a relic, a symbol of a fading world of secular learning and imperial administration. The cross became the emblem of a new reality, a world governed by spiritual authority and divine law. The transformation was complete. The power of the written word was not lost, but it was now channeled through a different vessel and for a different purpose. The libraries of the ancient world burned or fell into ruin, but in the scriptoriums of countless monasteries, monks were hunched over their desks, copying not the edicts of emperors, but the words of their God. The scroll had been folded, cut, and bound into the shape of the cross. The gods of Rome were made of marble and bronze. They stood in public squares, in temples, and in the private gardens of the wealthy. They were beautiful, serene, and perfect. These statues were not just art, they were manifestations of the divine physical anchors for belief. The statue of Augustus in his prime, the muscular form of Hercules, the serene face of Venus, these were the images of power, order, and civilization. To see them was to be reminded of the might and permanence of the Roman world. They were solid, tangible proof that the gods were present, and that the empire they watched over was eternal. Then the cracking began. It started not with hammers, but with neglect. As the old faith withered, the temples grew quiet. Dust gathered on the marble limbs, rain and wind began to wear away the perfect features. Then came the Christians, filled with a new and fervent certainty. For them, these were not gods, they were idols, empty shells inhabited by demons. Statues were toppled from their pedestals, noses were broken, eyes were gouged out. It was a deliberate act of symbolic violence, a declaration that the old powers were defeated. A headless statue of an emperor was a potent message. The old authority was gone, decapitated. This breaking of statues was a physical manifestation of the mental reset occurring across the empire. The classical ideal of human perfection, embodied in the flawless physique of the marble gods, was being rejected. The new faith celebrated a different kind of body, the broken, suffering body of Christ on the cross. It valued humility over pride, suffering over glory, and weakness over strength. The perfect, athletic bodies of the Greek and Roman sculptures represented a world that was passing away. The new art would focus not on external beauty, but on internal spiritual struggle. The cracks in the marble were cracks in the old worldview. From the fragments of these broken statues, something new was born. Sometimes the marble was burned to make lime for new buildings, churches for the new god. Other times, the shattered pieces were incorporated into new structures. A pagan head set into a Christian wall, a silent testament to a conquered past. This was not just destruction, it was a form of recycling, of reinterpretation. The past was not being erased but overwritten. The beautiful, cold, and distant gods of marble were being broken down, their materials repurposed to build a new world based on a story of brokenness, sacrifice, and ultimate resurrection. Roman maps were instruments of power. They were confident, clear, and comprehensive. The Pottinger table, for instance, was not a geographically accurate map in our sense, but a schematic diagram of the empire's road network. It showed a world that was organized, connected, and controlled from the center. Every road led, ultimately, back to Rome. The map was a declaration of mastery. It said, "We know this world, we have measured it, we have paved it, and we own it." The edges of the map were clear. Here lies the empire, and beyond there be barbarians. It was a world of straight lines and known distances. As the empire receded, these maps began to lose their meaning. The roads they depicted became impassable. The cities they named fell into ruin or changed their names. The world they described ceased to exist. In its place, a new kind of map began to emerge, the medieval Mappa Mundi. These were not maps for navigation, they were maps of theology. They were typically circular, with Jerusalem at the center, not Rome. The top of the map, where the sun rose, was the east, the Orient, and it was here that the Garden of Eden was often placed. The world was no longer a political territory to be controlled, but a spiritual landscape to be contemplated. These new maps were filled with wonder and terror. Where the Roman maps had clear borders, the medieval maps dissolved into a realm of myth. Here you would find the monstrous races described by Pliny the Elder, men with heads in their chests or with a single giant foot they used for shade. The world was no longer neatly divided between the civilized and the barbarian. Instead, it was a divinely ordered stage for the drama of salvation, surrounded by a periphery of the unknown and the demonic. The clarity of the Roman road map gave way to the complex symbolic geography of faith. The world, in a sense, lost its edges and became mysterious again. This fading of cartographic certainty reflected a deeper change in the human experience of space. For a Roman official, the world was a grid of provinces and roads. For a medieval peasant, the world was their village, the neighboring forest, and the local church. Beyond that lay a vast and perilous unknown, a place of pilgrims' tales and monsters' legends. The maps became foggy because the world itself had become foggy. The loss of the empire was not just a political event, it was a geographical one. The human mind withdrew from the wide, interconnected world of Rome into a smaller, deeper, and infinitely more mysterious cosmos. The period that followed the fading of Rome is shrouded in a peculiar fog. It is not that nothing was written, but that what was written had a different purpose. The great secular histories of Tacitus and Suetonius gave way to the chronicles of monks. These were not objective accounts of political events. They were moral histories, written to demonstrate the hand of God in human affairs. A plague was not a matter of public health. It was a divine punishment. The victory of a king was not a result of superior strategy. It was a sign of God's favor. History itself became a form of theology, a long and winding story whose only true author was God. This fog is also a fog of lost knowledge. The intricate systems of Roman engineering, sanitation, and administration slowly fell apart. The formula for concrete was forgotten. The ability to build aqueducts that spanned valleys was lost for centuries. This was not a willful act of ignorance, but the inevitable consequence of a society reorganizing itself around different priorities. Why maintain a complex sewer system when your primary concern is the purification of the soul? Why study the secular sciences when the ultimate truth is contained in a single holy book? The world became less interested in how things worked and more interested in what they meant. The very texture of the evidence changes. We move from the hard, clear inscriptions on Roman monuments to the beautiful but often ambiguous illuminated manuscripts of the monasteries. We have fewer coins, fewer legal documents, fewer personal letters from this era, the voices that speak to us from this time are overwhelmingly clerical. The lives of ordinary people, the vast majority of the population, are almost entirely silent. We see them through the lens of the church, as parishioners, as sinners, as serfs tilling the lands of a bishop or an abbot. The fog obscures not everything, but it certainly obscures the view from below. This historical fog is part of the period's haunting power. It feels mysterious because it was a time that embraced mystery. The Roman mind sought to classify, to measure, to control. The medieval mind was comfortable with the unknown, with the allegorical, with the idea that the visible world was merely a shadow of a greater invisible reality. The fog is not just a gap in our records, it is a reflection of the mindset of the age itself. They were not trying to build a world of clarity and light in the Roman sense. They were building a world of faith, and faith, by its very nature, must walk through shadows. And so we arrive at the question that haunts this entire period. Why do we still call them the Dark Ages? The term was coined by Renaissance scholars who saw themselves as rekindling the lost light of classical antiquity. For them, the centuries that lay between their time and the fall of Rome were a long barbaric night. It was a time of ignorance, superstition, and violence, a miserable interlude between two ages of glorious civilization. This narrative is powerful, simple, and deeply ingrained in our collective imagination. We picture mud, Vikings, and a world without learning. But is that all there is to the story? To call this era dark is to judge it by the standards of the world it replaced, and the world that eventually replaced it. It is to value secular literature over theological treatises, Roman engineering over Gothic architecture, and political history over the history of the soul. If we measure the age by its own standards, a different picture emerges. This was the age that laid the foundations for the modern West. It created the university. It developed the core concepts of law and rights that we still rely on. It was an age of immense creativity, not just in its cathedrals and its manuscripts, but in its political and social innovations. The darkness we perceive is perhaps a reflection of our own biases. We are the children of the Enlightenment, a culture that prizes reason, clarity, and empirical evidence. We are uncomfortable with an age that so thoroughly subordinated the material world to the spiritual. We look for the light of science and find only the flickering candlelight of the monastery. But for the people who lived in that time, that candlelight was more than enough. It was the light of the world, a beacon of hope in a fractured and dangerous landscape, promising a dawn that was not of this earth. So, when we look back into the fog of this great reset, what do we choose to see? Do we see only the collapse of an empire, the loss of knowledge, the darkness of superstition? Or can we perceive something else at work? Can we see the slow, painful birth of a new kind of civilization? One built on a radically different understanding of what it means to be human? The label Dark Ages tells us more about ourselves than it does about the past. It challenges us to ask whether we are blind to the light of an age that was illuminated not by the sun of reason, but by the pale, mysterious glow of faith. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe.